Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. It's time for the C3 stream. All right, good evening, welcome, hello, shalom. Yeah, that's appropriate, right? Because we're doing Old Testament stuff. Hey everybody, good evening and welcome to the C3 stream. Who's excited tonight? Picking up where we left off last week. I have a cranberry rooibos tea tonight. I think that's what it is. I think it's, yeah, it's a, you guys know what rooibos tea is? It's from Africa. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. Grab your tea, coffee, decaf. Grab a Bible, and settle in. We got more good stuff to do tonight. Welcome to the C3 stream. If you're joining us for the first time, we are on week 4. We're on week 4 of the curriculum called Divine Drama, and what it is a narrative look at the Bible, walking through kind of in greater detail is what we've been trying to do. We're taking our time, slowing down, taking our time, going through the Bible in a way that's accessible, understandable, trying to get a look at the characters. What are the big themes, big ideas, and try to get a better handle on the scriptures. So that's what we're doing. Should be good stuff. Good. If you got comments, throw them in the comment section for me as we go. If you guys got questions, thoughts, ideas, love seeing that on Facebook. If you're on YouTube, you can comment, but I don't have the... yeah, I think I can see if you guys comment too. Yeah. So if you want, throw it in there on YouTube as well. So, cool. Picking up where we left off last week. So if you guys ever miss a week or anything like that, you can always go on YouTube and you can watch, you can catch up. But we're on week 4. You know what? I just remembered. So we're gonna do something tonight. I wanted to show you guys a video. All right, I'm gonna show you a video that's a recap of really the opening of the Bible and stuff that we've already covered. And so but one of the things that I love doing is sharing with people good, healthy, constructive resources that can help them do the same thing that we're doing right now, like get a handle on the Bible. So there's a video that I want to show you. It's from a group called the Bible Project. Some of you might have heard of them before because I've used them before. We're going to watch this video. It's like 7 minutes, something like that, 6-7 minutes. And it's a great video. They provide all their videos free. You can go to the Bible Project. Just Google the Bible Project and you'll find it. You can find them on YouTube as well. They've got tons of great videos with these wonderful caricatures and animations and things like that that help get at the Bible. They produce everything for your edification, well-being, and it's entirely free. And they know their stuff. I appreciate there's some really fine, detailed, nuanced stuff that maybe we would split hairs over, but I really appreciate actually a lot of what they produce. So I'm going to show you a video tonight as kind of like a starter, as a way to kind of get us going, warm us up, and recap some of what we covered in Genesis 1 through 12, basically. And then we're going to pick up and dive in with Abraham, because that's where we left off last time, if you guys remember, with Abraham. So, hey, Joe, how you doing? Both Joes are here. Joe Dean is here. Joe Morrow is here. Glad you guys are here. You guys ready? Should we do it? Let's dive in. Let me show you this video, again, by the Bible Project. You can find this again later on. Just go to their YouTube channel or go to their website for more. So here you go. Here's a nice Genesis part 1 recap, if you will. Genesis 1 through 12. I'll overlay it with my narrative.
It's the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into 2 main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these 2 parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world.
I'm pausing it right now because I want to key in on that word blessing, guys. We're going to pick that word up as we study Abraham and as we look at Abraham's story and his kids, and how that blessing, that original blessing that was given to Adam and Eve, is handed down and expanded upon. So
now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world, and that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first catch.
So before, in some of the stuff that we looked at, one of the things I like about this video is the way it shows how sin spirals out of control. And we saw that in the last couple of weeks. That's what we've been seeing. That's what we've been noticing, is how sin gets worse and worse and worse. It spirals out of control. And there are various stories that show the extrapolation of sin and how sin exponentially grows. Here are some of the examples of some of those stories and other things we'll even touch on in this video that we didn't even cover together. But just to show you again how cleverly, in the same way they picked up in this video, that same spiraling out of control, that same sin kind of going rampant and getting bigger and bigger.
Casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed, or a descendant, will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake, too, will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision.
Okay, I'm pausing it again. In case you didn't get it, the idea of the wounded victor is something that is projected into Jesus, that Jesus becomes the descendant of Adam and Eve, the descendant of the woman. Jesus himself becomes that wounded victor, sacrificing himself, but in doing so, crushing death, crushing the rebellious spirit, crushing sin inside of us. And so in sacrificing himself, he welcomes the snake's bite, if you will, for our sake, and in doing so defeats death, defeats sin.
So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first, and the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now, this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
Okay, so there you go. Not bad, right? I mean, I think it's a really good, it's just a good summary for the kind of the introduction that we covered before. We covered those in the prior weeks. So the video comes out of, again, the Bible Project. They have a ton of videos on a ton of stuff, everything from topics to books of the Bible. They get into language. It's really good stuff. It's out of Portland. It's based, I believe, in the main voice that you're going to hear is Pastor Tim Mackey. I believe he's extremely intelligent, extremely highly educated, well educated in specifically biblical languages. I think he comes from the Reformed tradition, if memory serves. But brilliant guy, really brilliant guy. In fact, I think, if my memory's correct, he lives in Portland now, but he used to live in Madison. He was brought up in Madison. I want to say that's right. I want to say that's right. So. Yeah, glad you like the illustrations, Susan. I think they're really good. I think it's a great map, and it's a great way to help capture our attention, and it shows the narrative outline, right? I think it does a good job. I'm a big fan of doing illustrations and using visuals to help us grasp what's happening in the in the Bible. So, speaking of illustrations, I think it's time to dive into the Crossways material. So, you guys ready? Here we go. Here's our intro. Sweet. There you go. Pretty cool. All right. So this is where we left off. This is kind of where where the video leaves us off as well, is that hinging point of what is God going to do, right? With sin spiraling out of control, what action steps is God going to take in order to bring about redemption, healing, and so forth. So, and we find it gets narrowed down into a specific person, that God's activity, while it starts in the beginning very broad, very large, focuses more and more, gets more and more narrow down to a specific person. His name is Abram. And so where we saw last week is we picked up in Genesis chapter 12. And so we're going to be diving back into the Bible a lot tonight. We're going to be taking our time. I wanted to slow down specifically when we get to these next characters, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are considered the three patriarchs of the both the Jewish faith as well as the Christian faith. They're considered the patriarchs. Patriarch is a fancy way of saying fathers. They're kind of like the fathers of the faith, if you will. And it's these three guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, 3 generations, all the same family. So we're going to slow down and actually study them a lot more in depth. And that's one of the nice things that we're able to do on these Tuesday nights as you join us. The goal is not only to teach you some of the overarching perspectives and overarching principles, ideas, and themes, but also take certain moments where we can slow down and hold a microscope and get to know specific characters, get to look at specific themes. And so that's what we're going to be doing tonight and next week and maybe the week after that. Where we're going to slow down and look at these three guys, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the first big thing that happens in terms of Abraham is we learn that Abraham is part of a larger family. His father, Terah, moves across from kind of ancient Iraq, Iran, begins to move towards the Mediterranean, but settles on the way. God then approaches and really just kind of calls Abraham out of the blue. At the time, he's not named Abraham. His name is Abram. And Abram's just a dude. He's just a guy that God all of a sudden shows up in his life in some really significant ways. God is the one who is the main character and the main actor in the Bible over and over again. And if we're not careful, we can get confused by that. But in this case, it's pretty apparent. Abram's just doing his own thing, and all of a sudden, God shows up in his life. There's no indication that Abram knows God or has a faith with God or has any sort of religious practices prior to God showing up in his life. And so in the actual story, God shows up and immediately begins to speak to Abram and make some pretty substantial promises. He promises him 3 big things up front. The first one is he promises him land. He says, "Hey, I'm gonna ask you to get up and go west, young man." He calls Abraham further out west, further towards the Mediterranean Sea, and says, "Look, I'm going to be giving you, your family, your relatives, I'm going to give you a land that I will show you." And so, grab the camels, grab the stuff, grab the fam, and let's pack it up. Let's move farther out west. Not only am I going to bring you to a land that I'm going to give you as your own land, but on top of that, I am going to give you descendants. I'm going to give you a really big family. I mean, your family reunions are going to be huge, so not only are you going to have land, but you're going to have family, you're going to have descendants, you're going to have brothers, sisters, you're going to be a grandma, grandpa. It's going to be a big family. This is not a small family. This is such a big family that if you were to look up at the stars, if you were to count the grains of the sand, if you were to try to count them all, you just wouldn't be able to. It's going to be that many descendants. And then on top of that, eventually, all the families of the world, everybody, every person, everybody in the entire world is going to be blessed through you. You are going to be a blessing to all the earth, Abram. I'm going to bless everybody through you. And that's a huge indicator for us as readers to recognize, Okay. Everything that follows now, everything, we just saw it in the video. Everything from chapters 1 through 12 and the desperate situation of humanity hinges now on this guy and his family, his legacy, his story. What is God going to do through him? What is he going to do through his descendants? So that's kind of where we left off last time. And God not only makes his promise, he makes his promise in Genesis 12. Let me bring it up for you. Oh, look at the text. Yeah, there we go. All right, so here's Genesis 12. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you." This land. Go there. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, make you famous. You'll be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And so Abram packs everything up as he was instructed, and he takes off. He's got a wife. His wife's name is Sarai. Notice the I, it finishes AI. She eventually has a name change as well. She goes from being called Sarai to Sarah. And then he takes off with his nephew, Lot. And he heads to the land of Canaan. And so Canaan is along the coastline in what we would consider to be modern day Israel. Okay. Modern day Israel is based off of this. This is what modern day Israel is based off of. God supposedly giving the land along that coastline of ancient Canaan to Abram, his descendants, and so forth. So, I will give you the land to your descendants. And Abram's on board. He builds an altar and believes him. He worships God. He begins this lasting relationship with God. There's a bunch of weird stuff that happens in a bunch of other stories as you get to know Abram more and more. But even as you have this immediate of like, okay, I'm on board, and he builds an altar and he worships him, and it's like this, there he built another altar. He dedicated it to the Lord and he worshiped the Lord. You think like this Abram guy is like, he's a legit guy. Like, wow, upstanding. He believes God. He trusts God. He's moving his whole family across the sand, across the desert, because God somehow spoke to him. And this is like, wow, what a faithful guy. But then you find right after that, man, Abram has a lot of problems pretty fast. Abram is actually a broken person, just like the rest of us. Abram has his own fears, concerns, and issues like all of us. And so while with the person of, and we saw this through Noah, right? When God originally came to Noah, it was kind of like reset button, hoping that Noah was going to be above the whole sin issue. And then we found out, no. Even God's people, even God's chosen people struggle with sin. Even you and I, right? We struggle with sin. We're broken. We're selfish. We have that inward curvature of sin in our life as well. And so you're going to find that in Abram. You're going to find that over and over again in Abram's own story. In fact, shortly after God comes to him for the very first time, he tries to pawn his wife off as a sister. He tries to pawn his wife off because he's scared. And he does this not only once, but he ends up doing this twice. He does this again in chapter 20. He's scared of the local kings. He's scared, and he goes down to the border of Egypt. First off, he walks like right through the promised land. He gets there, and all of a sudden there's a famine, and so he bails and says, I'm going to go down to Egypt, and I'm going to get some bread down in Egypt. Egypt, throughout the entire biblical narrative, is known as like a bread basket. Egypt has the Nile. The Nile would flood in the rains would come, and the river would flood, and so there's lots of good farming and fertile land along the Nile. So Egypt has lots of good bread pretty much throughout all of history. It's consistently a good place to live along the Nile. Ancient Israel doesn't have as much. It's more barren. It's more empty. Along the Jordan River, when it floods, is very fertile. But along the coastline itself and a lot of the other areas, not so much. So Abraham goes and ends up actually booking it all the way down to Egypt. And when he's there, he's intimidated by the local ruler, the local pharaoh, the local king, and he tries to pawn his own wife off by saying, no, you go ahead, you take her. So Abram actually gives Pharaoh his wife. He feels like he doesn't have a choice in the matter, but so he ends up giving Pharaoh his wife. And this shows you right away that even though God came to Abram and God made all these incredible promises, God is going to have to overcome a lot of Abram. That's one of the reasons why this is such a great story, guys. The Bible is so good because it's so accurate. It's so true that Abram's a messy guy, and if God is going to somehow bless the world through this guy, it's going to take God. It's going to take God intervening and rescuing and working, because Abram keeps screwing up, man. He's messy like the rest of us. It's going to take a divine hand working through Abram in order to bring about the salvation of the world, because it ain't happening with just Abram, I'll tell you that much. So he ends up going down towards Egypt and tries to hand his wife off. God intervenes and says, Abram, how are you going to have descendants if you just pawned off your wife to the local pharaoh? That don't jive. I can't do what I need to do and what I said I would do through you if you don't have a wife. So God intervenes, and Abram gets his wife back. Thank you to God. God won. Abram, man, ugh. Another couple stories happen. The next big moment, some stuff happens with his nephew named Lot. Lot's a really messy character as well, so it runs in the family. But eventually you get to chapter 15, and 15 is where we see, it's kind of what we touched on at the very end of last week, where it's this weird, bizarro ritual that was actually commonplace in the ancient world, and it's depicted here in the graphic that you see here by the fire and the smoking pot, the smoke that's kind of coming up from this incense burning thing. What happens is God instructs Abram to take a bunch of animals and cut them in half. And what he's doing is he's establishing what was historically considered to be a covenant, a promise. Back in the day, you know, all the legal documents that you sign and all the stuff that's really intense when you do something significant that binds you in a legal way to someone. Back in the day, they didn't have a lot of scrolls just to lie around. Parchment was actually a rarity, an oddity in the ancient world. And so you made pacts, you made agreements, you made business dealings, you made promises in very different ways. And one of the most pronounced ways to enter into a really formal and significant long-term promise covenant. That's that fancy word, covenant, that we talk a lot about in the Bible, actually. Covenant is this idea of a really lasting, really strong promise that cannot be broken. In fact, the New Testament and Old Testament are sometimes referred to as the New Covenant or the Old Covenant. And it's got to do with this relationship that develops between God and God's people. In this case, between God and Abraham. And it all stems back to this moment where God enters into this covenant agreement with Abram by saying, I am going to do what I promised I would do, Abram. I promise you as God that I will give you land, I will give you descendants, and you're going to be a blessing to the nations. I need you to trust me on this. And so you take these animals, you cut them in half, and you walk between the animals. And the idea is, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain, if I end up being lax on this, you have every right to do to me what we've done to these animals. So it's a pretty significant thing. I mean, you're kind of like pledging and bonding your very livelihood to this other person. What's fascinating about this is that as God instructs Abram to do this, he puts Abram into a deep sleep, and Abram sees the manifestation of God in this moment is this smoking pot and this fire that goes and travels between the animals. But Abraham himself actually does not go through the animals. This is an oddity and this is a rarity. This is an exception. Normally two people would go through the animals. What this largely signifies is what we just mentioned a moment ago. It's going to take God, and it's going to be really up to God to bring salvation and to do what God promised. It doesn't depend on Abraham. It doesn't depend on Abram to hold up his end of the deal, because he just can't. He's too broken. He's too messy. He screws up too easily. It's one of the reasons he's so lovable. But God promises that he will do what he will do, and he makes that promise to Abraham. So it's a really substantial moment in the biblical narrative, and that happens in Genesis 15. It's a really big moment. Yeah, here we go. Let's read it together. So here's Genesis 15. I'm starting up at verse 17. After the sun went down, darkness fell. Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day. Okay, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens before it. But I have given this land to your descendants, all the way to the border of Egypt, to the great Euphrates River, the land now occupied by... So this is a big moment as God kind of, in chapter 12, we get the initial call. In chapter 15, we get like a really formal solidifying of the experience. It really solidifies. So now, even as this happens, right, God comes and promises Abram that this is all going to happen. He's super formal about it. It's a super big deal with all these animals and all this stuff. Time is passing, and Abram is getting older. Abram's getting older. God has made the promise now to him, not just once, but he's reiterated it and formalized it a second time. And yet, Abram does what it's actually part Sarah too. It's not just Abram, but basically Sarah and Abram are getting along in years, and they're looking at each other like, hey, the biological clock is ticking, and God said we'd have a lot of sons and descendants and all that, and they start to think, well, I don't know, and they do what people do. They took matters into their own hands. That's what they did. They're looking at Sarah's biological clock. They're looking at Abram, and they're looking at each other thinking, man, the window is closing. We got to hop on this. And Sarah, if you can't get pregnant, and if you're getting older and we're having issues with you getting pregnant, maybe God would be okay if we do this a little bit different. Maybe there's another way, a workaround, a plan B, if you will. Talks about it like this in 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, despite God's promise. But she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. Shocker. Abram agrees. Well, honey, if you think so, if you think that's what I've got to do, all right, I'll step up to the plate just for you, honey. You can just hear Abram at this point, right? I mean, come on. So Abram, shocker, goes and sleeps with Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, and this. There we go. Abram had sexual relations with Hagar. She became pregnant. Okay, so here they are, Sarah and Abram finding a workaround. Sarah thinks, I'll surrogate, right? Basically, surrogate mom. I'll go get her pregnant, and then when the baby's born, give the baby to me, and I'll raise it as my own. That's the idea here. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to mistreat her mistress. Ooh, not good. Began to treat her with contempt. This is great, guys. Look at this. This is just so people. So now she's the favored one because she's pregnant, and starts treating her previous mistress, right, as she's walking around like, I'm pregnant, you're not. And what happens? Sarai goes to Abram and says, this is all your fault. This is so rich. I love the Bible. Don't you love the Bible? I mean, I do. I think this is hilarious. So Sarah now blames Abram. You got her pregnant. I can't believe it. This is all your fault. Why in the world? I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. Oh, woe is me. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. Are you guys anything in the comments? No, nothing in the comments. You're all just being quiet. Come on, this is funny. I think it's funny. I think it's funny because of how accurately it depicts the ways in which humans, we try when we have an idea and we want to get something done. This is the sort of stuff we come up with. It's just so accurate. Abram replies, look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. AKA, I don't want to deal with it. It ain't my problem. He's like, no, not me. Honey, do whatever you think is right. He's like, I am not getting in the middle of this like chick fight. Like, not happening. He's terrified. He turns tail and runs and says, honey, whatever you want. So Sarai treats Hagar so harshly, Hagar runs away. Hagar's like, I'm out of here. And I'm taking my baby with me. Oh my gosh. Right? I know. This stuff is worth TV. I mean, it really is. This is just so yes. You guys, yes. Wholeheartedly yes. I mean, this is drama. This is the Bible, in case you didn't know this, is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's people. It's just people. So here we go. She runs away, right? She books it. God sees this. God sees that Hagar is now crying by herself. Sends an angel saying, what are you doing? What is going on here? She says, I'm running away. The angel says, go back to her. She's your mistress. Look, I'm gonna do something great through you too, Hagar. I will give you more descendants than you can count. You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael. Okay? Which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. So what's happening here? God is saying, okay, Hagar, it's been tough. This is what happens when people take things into their own hands. Y'all didn't just wait for me to do my thing. You wanted to speed the process up. Hagar, look, you're going to have a kid. He's going to be wild. Okay, this kid's going to be like bouncing off the walls, and he's going to be a tough kid. He's going to be a tough kid, and he is going to grow up, and he's going to be a tough adult. He's going to be one of those guys that's just tough as nails, you know? And that's kind of where it leaves it. She acknowledges it. She says, you're the God who sees me. And so you get this child named Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is Abram's only son at this point in time. Y'all tracking so far? Ishmael is the only biological son of Abram with Hagar. Ishmael, according to tradition, I think Joe Dean, you were asking about this last time. The Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and in fact the Muslim faith all trace their heritage, lineage, and faith roots back to the person of Abram. They all trace back to the person of Abram. And specifically, while the Jewish and Christian tradition continue through Abram's second biological son named Isaac, the Muslim faith believes that God's favor and God's plan is followed through Ishmael. So the Muslim faith here diverges from the Christian and Jewish tradition. According to the Muslim faith, Ishmael is the father that they trace their lineage back through to Abram. So when Muslims, Jews, and Christians talk about having similar backdrops or Abram in common, this is the point of divergence. Ishmael and his legacy, lineage, and what happens to him and his story is carried on through the Muslim faith. The Christian faith ascribes to the Jewish faith, believing that God's blessing and what God's promise to bless the world is brought not through Ishmael, but through Abram's second child, who we are about to learn about in a couple chapters. But first we get Genesis 17. This is when the name change happens. Good. I'm glad you're enjoying the commentary. It's fun. This is good stuff. Let me show you this. This is good. Okay, so this is I'm glad, Michelle, you like it. That's so fun. So this is a great image because it shows the different family tree. This is the family tree. And so you can see Adam's at the top. You track through Seth, Noah, hang right, and you get Shem, and Terah being the father of Abram. Okay. Abram himself has some brothers. He's got his nephew Lot over there. But then you see Abraham splits into these two dominant trees, one being Ishmael and the second being Isaac. So the reason I wanted to show this to you is because, again, of what we see in this is the split between Jewish Christian go right to Isaac, Muslim goes left to Ishmael. And you get a couple verses in chapter 25 about him, basically reiterating that he is a wild, hostile, aggressive adult, according to Genesis. Okay. Genesis 17. Let's pop back over. Genesis 17. When Abram was 99 years old, just getting up there. When he's 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. Now, don't get bent out of shape, and please don't ask me about the years in 99 versus how old Abraham was. The point is he's old. Okay, that's the point. He's old. He's gray. He's old. He's getting on in life. When the Bible uses time, don't get bent out of shape about how much time. It's like 40 days versus 40 years. Was that actually 40 24-hour periods? Don't get bent out of shape by that stuff. The point of tracking Abram's age is to show that he continues to get older and older. When we first meet Abram earlier on, it says he's old. And it gives you a name. It says he's getting old in years, and it lists how many years. And since you keep getting all these stories about Abram, it keeps reiterating how he's getting older and older. That's why you see those years keep creeping in. It's because it's trying to show you Abram continues to age, and that big swaths of time is passing. What that means in a very practical way is that God made some promises, but those promises take time to actualize. Those promises take time to materialize. That's faith, people. There's faith. Faith is anticipating and waiting and believing that God will deliver on it even when you don't have it right in front of you. And that's Abram's whole life is lived from one story to the next, anticipating where big swaths of time is passing, and he still doesn't have all these descendants. I mean, here he is. Years have gone by where God first said this is going to happen. It's not like he woke up the next day with a kid. He didn't wake up the next day with land. He didn't wake up the next day knowing that he was going to, the whole blessing to the nations thing was happening. He's just a dude doing his thing and trusting God's going to do God's thing. So time is passing. He's getting old. God comes to him again in 17. I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. This is a big term, El Shaddai. El Shaddai is a big deal. It's a big deal. I'm God Almighty. I am God, the Almighty One, the only one. Serve me faithfully. Live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee you countless descendants. So now, just as we got the formalized covenant happening in 15, here we are 2 chapters later, and it's kind of a continuation of what's already begun. Okay? It's more covenant, promise, relationship language stuff. And it's almost like God didn't finish the covenant in the very first time. Like back in chapter 12, all the way through 17, although it's taking years to happen, it's almost like it's an ongoing conversation between God and Abram. Abram falls down when he sees God, and God says, "This is the covenant I make with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham." And if you find out, Abram means exalted father. Abraham sounds like a Hebrew term that means the father of many. Okay, so God's doing a play on words. It goes from super cool father to the father of many people, many peoples. Now, this is kind of ironic because, of course, at this point in time, the guy's got one kid. He's got an illegitimate kid at that. He's got a kid through Hagar, and that's it. So he's old, has one illegitimate child, and God all of a sudden is changing his name to say, "You shall be the father of many nations." In case you didn't get it, I'm changing your name. In fact, I will make you extremely fruitful. Wink, 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 wink. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. Basically, Abraham don't need no blue pill. Abraham, you are fruitful, fertile. You're gonna have more kids. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I mean, these are pretty lofty promises. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. So what God is doing in this part of the covenant relationship is he's focusing the conversation on descendants, on babies, and Abraham's biggest struggle, which is, I don't have a legitimate kid yet. I don't have a kid by my own wife, by Sarah, my first wife. Obviously, this is causing problems from Abram spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. And God kind of narrows in on it and says, listen, it's happening, man. It's happening. In fact, I will confirm with you and promise you that this is going to happen. So much so that I will make an everlasting covenant with you, a promise that's going to be handed down from generation to generation. You can count on this, buddy. You can take this to the bank. And by the way, just in case you forget, I will give you the entire land of Canaan where you now live as a foreigner to your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. So chapter 17, this is all about babies. Babies. This is all about babies. And Abram's, at this point, inability to make babies, and God saying, it's gonna happen. He then goes so far as to say, look, it's going to happen, and in fact, I want you, your family, I want you to have a physical, visible sign of this promise. I want a definitive way that distinguishes you from all the other peoples of the world. And this is something that's going to be true for you, and I want you to hand this on to your kids and your kids' kids and on into future generations, so that all those kids will be able to know that they indeed belong to this promise, that the promise that I am making for you, it's being handed down. It's not like God's promise stopped with Abraham. God's promise is being given through Abraham to future generations. That's a big distinguisher, okay? So when Abram dies, God's favor and God's promise does not die with him. It gets handed on. And to show you that, to help you and your children know, understand, recognize that, and remember that, I want you to be circumcised. Ooh, The guy's 99 and he's got to take a flint knife to himself. Ooh, you want to talk about an act of faith? Here you go. You must cut off the flesh of your foreskin as a sign of covenant between me and you. From generation to generation, every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day of his birth. This applies to your family, servants, everybody. This is for everybody. And this conversation around circumcision actually goes all the way to Jesus. I mean, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And the mark of the covenant, circumcision becomes the way in which kind of the first benchmark of being included within the Jewish family. Men need to be circumcised. For those of you who traveled through Paul with me, the study of Paul, if you remember, the big argument was, can you believe in Jesus? Do you have to be Jewish in order to believe in Jesus? Jesus is a Jewish Messiah. Do you have to be Jewish in order to follow him? And if so, that means you got to be circumcised. So all the Greeks who are not Jewish, who want to follow Jesus, are all like, come again? We have to what? We have to do, in order to follow Jesus? I didn't know that was part of it. It goes all the way back to here. Genesis chapter 17, Mark of the Covenant. Okay. Not only is Abram's name changed, but so is his wife's. Regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, she will be Sarah. Ba-ba-da-ba. Sarai and Sarah both mean princess. The change in the spelling may reflect the difference in dialect between which is the historical place that they came from, and Canaan, which is along the Mediterranean. Kind of saying like, just like something changed with Abraham, something has changed as well with Sarah. She's in this too. This is not just Abram. If it was just Abram, then the whole Hagar thing would have panned out, but it's not. God made his promise and said, look, Abram, you and Sarah will bear a child. And so it's gotta be Sarah. I will bless her and give you a son from her. Now, let's be clear. Just as Abraham is getting up in age, so is Sarah. Yes, I will bless her richly. She'll become a mother of many nations. Kings and nations will become her descendants. This is great. Abram bows down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100? And how can Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? So, Abram says to God, may Ishmael, his son through Hagar, live under your special blessing. And this is a moment of doubt. This is what 17 is all about. Abram still doesn't get it. Abram still isn't quite on board. He's got disbelief going on. Like, it's a great idea, God, but man, that biological clock came and went for us both. God's, so he says, just let your blessing, let this promise travel through Ishmael. God says, no. Abram, I told you back when. I told you back. Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac. Okay, so this is so this is what happens. You have this tension between Ishmael and Isaac. God says, I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, his descendants, as an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you asked. I will make him extremely fruitful. I will multiply his descendants. He'll become the father of 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. When God finished speaking, he left Abraham. Okay, so that's the big break point. The promise, according to the Jewish faith and the Christian faith and Genesis, the blessing travels through Isaac, not Ishmael. God still blesses Ishmael. God still does, says, hey, he's gonna go. Things are gonna go well with him. He's gonna be fruitful. He's gonna multiply. He's gonna become a great nation in his own right. But my covenant, verse 21, my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who is legitimately through your wife. That's how this is going down. So Abram does it. Takes everybody and then he circumcises them. Oofta. Woof. Okay, so that's 17. What time is it? 8:24. Okay, we got to get through Abraham. We got to finish Abraham, people. We didn't even get to Isaac. So a little while later, there's this experience. There's an experience that happens. It's this crazy story. It's a pretty cool story. I don't want to get bogged down in it in the moment. It's called the Theophany. It's a revelation type. It's cool. It's good stuff. And basically, God comes to Abraham and Sarah, and says, "Hey, get ready. You're gonna have that baby." Still hasn't happened yet, right? So probably a little bit of time has gone by. Not too much time, because God said within, by this time next year. So some angels show up. God's presence shows up, and kind of through these angels, so to speak, figures. There's debate. I don't want to get lost in it. God comes to Abram in Abraham's tent, and Sarah overhears the conversation, and God says, "Yeah, hey, your wife is gonna be pregnant, like anytime." And Sarah laughs. She's like, "Yeah, right, man." and the angel like calls her on it. Says, "Sarah, did you laugh? I heard you laughing back there, making little pancakes or whatever for us to eat. You laughed, but I told you it's going to happen." She's like, "No, I didn't laugh." And he's like, "Yeah, you did." It's a really awkward story. You got another one in there, Sodom and Gomorrah. Don't get lost on that. Not that important for the moment. It's a big story for a lot of people like to talk about it, but let's not, because it's not essential to Abram. It shows the intimacy of relationship, though, in the banter, the back and forth that Abram has with God. Jump to 21. Let's jump to 21. So here we're picking up in 21. More time has passed, and here we go. The Lord kept his promise and did for Sarah exactly what he promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abram circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Holy cow. Shoot dang. I think of how tired I am, and I got a little ways to go before I'm 100, and man, when we had our peanuts, holy cow, I was exhausted. I can't imagine being 100 and having a newborn. Woo! They didn't have all the fancy stuff we do. They did not have baby monitors, They were the baby monitors. God declared, Sarah declares, "God has brought me laughter." And I believe that's what Isaac means, right? Yeah. So Isaac means he laughs. That's what Isaac means. He laughs. So this is another play on words. I'm basically saying God made this promise. Sarah laughed at it. And then God said, no, this is really going to happen. In fact, you need to name your kid after the fact that I'm going to make this happen. And you laughed. You thought this wasn't possible, but it's happening. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. As soon as Isaac shows up, things get awkward. Now you have a teenage son, Ishmael, and a newborn Isaac. Isaac's the legitimate heir through his first wife. And so Abram sends Hagar and Ishmael away. He sends them off into the desert. And God grows up with him, skillful archer. And basically he ends up being Ishmael ends up being a strong person and a strong character. He has some dealings with some locals, And then you get in chapter 22, almost done, guys. In 22, we get a very famous experience with Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham takes his son up a mountain, Mount Moriah. And, well, there's a debate, but anyways. Go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. All right, so at first glance, this is like, say what? Are you kidding me? What did God just say? God has this big test with Abram to ask the question of how much does Abram trust in, believe, how confident is he in God? God gave him this child, Isaac, and then God says, I want you to offer that child to me as a sacrifice. Now, this is ironic because God hates child sacrifice, and later on in the Bible he condemns it at every moment he can. In fact, it's a sad reality, but later on we'll see that the Jewish people actually fall into the practice of child sacrifice as they embrace the local gods, as they reject the one true God, and they pick up some local practices. One of the local practices they pick up is child sacrifice, and God hates it. But here we have an example where God is saying, I want you to practice child sacrifice. The story is pretty incredible and it's pretty detailed. But at the last moment, what happens is God says, no, don't lay a hand on the boy. Do not hurt him in any way. For now I know that you truly fear God. You have not even withheld even your son from me, your only son. So there's a lot of layers here. You know, what is it to have your son, your only son, the child of the promise, sacrificed? You can pick up on Jesus' themes here, that God himself would not withhold his son from sacrifice. You pick up on how God condemns at an early age child sacrifice. You pick up on the idea of martyrdom, that Isaac almost becomes, in essence, one of the first martyrs. Willingly recognizing that he's ready to give up his life for what God will do. But God delivers, it all kind of, it decompresses, and God does not, God essentially saves, if anything, Isaac by saying, no, don't. In fact, here is a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. And he says, sacrifice that. So that's what happens. Pretty intense stuff. Very intense stuff. Very complicated story. Lots of commentary can be made. Lots of commentary has been made. I think the big thing that I would take away from this for you and I'd offer up for you is just that even in the more complicated and more difficult moments, God continues to be the one, to be the primary actor and be in this meaningful relationship with Abraham. And sometimes that relationship gets really strained, really confusing, really awkward. But it continues on. So that is pretty much the last major story of Abraham. His wife dies eventually, Sarah, 127 years old. She passes away. He buys a grave. And go back to that. He buys a grave and buries her in the grave. And then he himself grows a little bit older and passes his blessing on to Isaac. We'll pick up with Isaac next week, and we'll look at the next major patriarch figure. We'll look at Isaac and Jacob next week. Abraham's arguably one of the most complex and robust characters in the entire Bible. You kind of go from Abram. The next major character that we'll see is probably Moses, who's kind of on par with Abram. Is probably Moses. But that's Abraham's story. Very confusing, very complex, very rich though with brokenness, and yet God continuing to work and really grounding us to be able to say, like, okay, this dude and his family, somehow God is going to save the world through them. Yeah. Questions, thoughts, commentary. If you got some, throw it in the comments now. It's already 8:30. Holy cow, time flies with you guys. Time flies when you're having fun. Yeah. So there you go. That's another week of divine drama. Bum, ba, ba. We'll pick it up next week with Isaac. Hopefully you got a lot of insight and understanding into Abram. Yeah, very much so. Trudy, there's a lot of question about how old Isaac was. Most people think he like maybe a teenager. Some people think a young man. In fact, that's where the martyrdom idea comes from, actually, is the idea of maybe he was a young man and willingly, laid down on the rock. Other people think he was a bit younger and just had big eyes and was like, Dad's taking me up the mountain to do what? The Jewish scripture, actually, Jewish Talmud, which is a commentary on the Bible, actually has a commentary story about what it would have been like to be Sarah seeing Abraham and Isaac go walking up the mountain, trying to climb inside her heart. But it's very, very interesting. Joe, how long after the time Abraham was this written? Oh, good question. Okay, so the question is, how long after Abraham existed or lived was this stuff written down? Really hard to know. Really, there is no good answer there. We don't know. We legit don't know. And the reason is because the backdrop there is oral tradition. And so for generation upon generation, this stuff would have been handed down in oral tradition before it was written down. A lot of people think that the majority of the texts weren't even ever really formally written down until like the Babylonian exile, that you get a bunch of stuff actually kind of compiled and written down, moved from people's minds and what they were thinking, oral tradition, into a more written format. Written stuff was not common for generations still with this. I mean, you think like writing itself was not prevalent in the ancient world at this time, or for generations to come even. The few scraps that we have are indicators of like how language was forming at this time. Probably the best example parallel that we can get at earliest would be like ancient Egypt, and where we can see some inscriptions regarding ancient Egypt. But this nomadic tribes and stuff like this would not have been writing this stuff down. They would have been oral tradition. Oral tradition, guys, is stuff where you would memorize huge amounts of information, like big stories, and you would memorize those stories, and you would be required to memorize them in a specific way and have them just committed to memory and regurgitate them. Very, very specific. Nothing like we have now. People's memories were radically different back then, in part because they exercised their minds different than we exercise our minds today. We use modern technology, and we use words and letters and things like that to help capture things, right? But they would have trained their minds, and they would have trained themselves to hand down these stories and huge amounts of information very cleanly and very clearly. Some people kind of get suspect about oral tradition, like there's no way people could have memorized. Oh yeah, no, it's totally true. We are just not accustomed to that because we have our phones and we Google whatever we don't know. So oral tradition up front, and then written down many, many, many generations later. Good. Glad you had fun. Glad you enjoyed it, Susan. Interesting and entertaining. We try. Well, guys, thanks for hanging out with me. If you got more questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. We'll be picking up next week with Isaac and kind of taking it from there. As always, I love hanging out with you guys and encourage you to continue to hang out with me and others that are part of the online community, whether you are joining us online or on site. There's a lot of stuff that goes on during the week as being part of Christ Church, and there's a bunch of stuff based on your comfort level, gathering in person or gathering online. So I just want to lift that up. This is a great example of how you become part of our church community by showing up on these Tuesday nights. I really value that, and I appreciate that. I'm really grateful that you continue to be part of our community by showing up and hanging out with me on Tuesday nights. Sunday mornings, please do, as always, guys, join us 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10:30. If you know somebody, tag somebody. We're still in a sermon series called Under God, having to deal with how we navigate as Christian people the realm of politics Pastor Bob has been preaching on it, and if you have been missing it, woo, you gots to check it out. So, and then 7:30 a.m. you can join me for Thursday morning meditation. I had a blip this last Thursday. I was out of town, and the auto played the wrong video, but that's okay. We're catching up this week. So, join me Thursday morning though. Scripture reading, prayer, and then Holy Spirit shout outs, God stories, just kind of recognizing what God's been up to in and around us. So thanks so much. Thanks for joining me tonight. I hope you have a wonderful time for the rest of your evening. God bless. We'll see you Thursday. And if we don't see you on Thursday, hope to see you on Sunday. Go lift some lives. Go elevate Christ. Go be a church for those who aren't here yet. And we'll talk to you and see you all soon. Thanks for joining me tonight, guys.